the Septuagint versus the Masoretic, the only ministry in the world where we look at the Septuagint and the Masoretic text side by side, line by line, from Genesis to the end of the prophets to find out the truth of scriptures. Today we're looking at Deuteronomy chapter 21. There are 23 verses. Verse 1, we have an omission of with the sword. In verse 2, we have an omission of the distances. In verse 4, we're ignoring that verse. Verse 5 says, stand by him, referring to Yah, versus to minister unto him. Verse 6, we see the head of the heifer, which was slain, versus beheaded, which means in the Septuagint, the head could still be connected to the body versus not be connected to the body. In verse 9, if and when being used, if versus when, I should say. Seems to be a continuous difference, but it's good to point that out anyhow. And it says here, it expresses good and pleasing versus right. Verse 10, if versus when. And then take their spoil versus take them captive. So we can see here, spoil could include people, but in the Masoretic it specifically says only the captives. Verse 11, an omission of in countenance, as it is connected to the beauty of a woman. So this woman is beautiful, specifically in her face. Verse 12, an addition of the word home. A significant difference as well in the same verse, where we can see the husband is playing a more active role in implementing this law, and that he is the one shaving her head and also taking away her garments of captivity. In the Masoretic, she is the one shaving her head, and she is the one taking off those garments or raiment of her captivity. We have an omission, I should say, verse 13, it says, she shall. So that was added. And dwell with her in the Septuagint, and dwell with her versus to be her husband. So the Septuagint is mandating that the man live with her, physically live with the wife, versus simply assume the title of husband. There's no requirement to live with the wife. In verse 14, a significant difference is noted. She shall not by any means be sold for money, versus you shall not sell her at all. So there is a possible loophole here where a man, a husband, could say, okay, I'm not to sell her, but I'll give her to somebody else. You do the selling. No, there's no room for that kind of foolishness in the Septuagint. Nobody is to sell her at all, period. Again, versus other people that are not to you can sell her. A big difference as well in this verse, you shall not treat her contemptuously, which is very avant-garde, is very much ahead of its time, considering not only the Middle East and the culture there, but also considering that this was written in ancient times, where women's rights were even worse. Let's put it that way. Versus you shall not make merchandise of her. So the Septuagint is specifically expressing that women, specifically this woman, this wife, should not be mistreated, especially with hate or contempt. Versus do not sell her, which is redundant because that was mentioned already, not to do that. Verse 16, we have an omission of divide by inheritance his goods, and another omission of having overlooked regarding the son of the hated wife, which is the firstborn technically. Verse 17, because he is the first of his children, and to him belongs the birthright. Verses, for he is the beginning of his strength, rather poetically stated, and the right of the firstborn is his. Verse 18, a significant difference here. Disobedient and contentious versus stubborn and rebellious. So you can be disobedient and rebellious. Those are rather similar, not exactly the same, but similar. But a contentious person is someone who's argumentative, who likes to fight, somebody who's very much confrontational, versus someone who's stubborn. That does not mean that they are argumentative or confrontational. It could mean they just do not want to change. They're set in their ways. In verse 18, it also says this individual is corrected. This can be verbal, this can be physical, but in the Masoretic it is saying chasten. They have chastened him. So that sounds more like corporal punishment only, no verbal correction. Verse 19, the place versus his place. So the city versus your private residence. Verse 20, men of their city versus elders of the city. More inclusive in the Septuagint because men are all ages. Not all ages, but I should say of 20 years and up, most likely. Elders, specifically the seniors. And reveler versus a glutton. Reveler is someone who is a partier, a pleasure seeker, versus a food addict. It is notable that a reveler can include somebody who is a drunkard who is also a glutton, but a glutton is more it's more pigeonholed. There's nowhere else to go with that. It's just you're a glutton. Very specific description and type of behavior. Verse 21, the evil one, describing that contentious, disobedient son, versus evil. And it says here, the rest shall hear and fear versus all Israel. So the rest could include possibly the alien or the stranger that is dwelling among Israel, and they're still being converted, they're still learning the ropes. Verse 22, if there be sin in any one, and the judgment of death be upon him, versus if a man have committed a sin worthy of death. So this not only calls to mind the Messiah, but it also expresses that if a man have committed a sin, how do you determine that? Well, a witness, multiple witnesses. However, if sin is found in anyone, that usually requires an investigation. So that could include not only how it's described in the Masoretic, where witnesses would be needed, because how else would you determine someone committed a sin if no one witnessed it? There were no eyewitnesses or ear witnesses. But if there be sin in anyone, that requires an investigation. So it's more open to different possibilities, different scenarios here. Verse 23, his body remain all night upon the tree. And it says here, you shall by all means bury it in that day. So versus in any wise bury him that day. A significant difference is it uses the word and in the Septuagint, and you shall by no means defile the land. So in addition to this law, don't defile the land, because you can defile the land by breaking this law and multiple other laws. However, in the Masoretic, it's saying this is how you defile the land because of this specific command being breached. One thing I noticed as well is that the way it is written, you shall by no means defile the land, sounds more, to me, it sounds more like a warning not to break this. Meaning this is a serious breach to break this law and to defile the land. Do not do it. Do not do it. So it's a direct commandment from Yah through Moses. And that's all I have for you for this chapter. Thank you very much for your time. May Allah bless you and keep you and make your way prosper. Until next time, we'll look at Deuteronomy chapter 22. Yah bless you all, and Maranatha.